Hello and welcome to another Piper Pod. This is part 2 of Metabolism and Energy. Last time in part 1 we looked in pretty considerable detail the process in which a carbohydrate is broken down into glucose and then its travel through the 3 stages of glycolysis, citric acid cycle and then the electron transport chain. This time around we're going to look at alternative fuel sources that the body can utilize in order to enter the energy producing cycle, but then also some of the byproducts and stages that it has to go through in order to actually achieve that in the absence of carbohydrates. Okay, getting right into it, we need to talk about the liver. The liver is the most active by far metabolic organ within the body. It is the first to metabolize thing. It remetabolizes byproducts. It takes care of toxin buildup. It's responsible for storage and changing certain molecules to be stored, and it's also very important for your absorption. So from your digestive system you have a hepatic portal that takes all the nutrients in whatever form they are, and it goes straight into the liver. From there, with the help of the digestive system and the liver, it's breaking down our food sources, our protein, carbohydrates and fats, into absorbable elements, which is either your amino acids, your different sorts of monosaccharides that we have, and then glycerol and fatty acids as well from the food. Now, the liver, after we break down those particular elements, they've converted food into usable forms of energy that we'll talk about, and it's also given a storage capability for later on. So the liver itself, as far as producing energy for itself, will actually utilize fats first and store your carbohydrates. So the liver is one of those unique organs that will prefer to utilize the fats that it breaks down as its main source of energy, and then it will store your triglycerides from there. So looking at the fats as a source of energy, we really have two options when they're broken down. Our fats, or our lipids, so once they get to the form of lipids, they're broken down further, and two different types, glycerol and fatty acids, are utilized differently in the metabolism of the cell. And we'll look at each one of those in relative detail anyway. So first of all, the breakdown of fats. Once it's in the stomach, it is broken down a little bit by your bile. Your bile helps break it down this a little bit further into your triglycerides and your monoglycerols, and as they get broken up. But the main thing is at the small intestine itself, where you get lipase injected by the pancreas that breaks it down further. And within the help of the lipase and the actual intestine wall for absorption region, we can break them down further into your lipoproteins, which means they can be absorbed into the bloodstream eventually, and then they can be hydrolyzed by the liver in order to produce glycerol and your fatty acids. So what is produced is your triglycerides within the cell, and the triglycerides consists of a glycerol backbone with 3 fatty acid chains, hence it becomes a triglyceride. And it's this triglyceride that is what is transported around the body and taken to cells before it's broken down for the rest of the body to utilize. And that's how fats work. Now, fats are pretty useful. Okay, once they're sort of stored in the body as your triglycerides, they will become your fatty acids and your glycerol. Your fatty acids will be sent away and they'll be used to build structures. So they're responsible for your steroid-based hormones, production of a lot of your plasma membrane, so the phospholipid membrane of your cell structure, and essentially they're also utilized within cholesterol, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Now, when the fats are needed, they're catabolized within the adipose tissue itself, and it's broken down and entered the bloodstream. So the two substances, fatty acids and glycerol, will enter the bloodstream. Now, glycogen plays a role in this side of the house when there isn't enough food. Okay, when there's no carbohydrates around, your glycogen will actually assist in this catabolization of your triglycerides. When you're stressed or when the body needs fuel straight away, then it's your cortisol and your epinephrine, or your adrenaline, that plays a role in that. Once these substances are in the blood, then they travel to different tissues in order to enact their metabolic pathway. So, as I mentioned, the fatty acids in that normal state, they're used to build structures. Okay, that's what they are. They're responsible for cholesterol. When they need to be utilized as energy, then they are broken down further into glycerol and fatty acids and then utilized in different pathways. Now, a gram of fat, if you will, can yield twice as much ATP. Okay, but part of the problem is the byproducts that are produced as a result of it. So they don't want to do it forever, ideally, and we'll talk about reasons why soon. So glycerol comes from fat. Glycerol is a nice simple one because we've essentially already talked about the process. Once glycerol itself travels to the liver, it goes through a process known as glucogenesis, and that breaks glycerol down into glucose within the liver. From there, it follows the exact same pathway as your glucose molecule did in the last one. So it goes through glycolysis, produces pyruvate, has your ATP, enters the Krebs cycle, and goes from there. Okay, no problems at all. Now, this obviously happens all the time for the liver. This is how the liver gets its energy. But this also happens based on the availability of glucose. Now, the reason we need to convert these things to glucose is because certain parts of the body prefer it, and other parts of the body can only use glucose as fuel. So red blood cells, for example, can't use anything else but glucose as fuel. In the brain, neural tissue, they prefer to. They don't like using fat or proteins as fuel, and only in extreme circumstances will they use your ketones as its fuel source. Okay, but when the diet is low in carbohydrates, then glucose must come from an additional source. So this is one of the ways it happens. So that's what happens with your glycerol. Your fatty acids, on the other hand, they take a slightly different route. Your fatty acids are used as energy if there is no carbohydrates available and you need energy quickly. So remember before we talked about your glycolysis, aerobic, and then there was two different pathways that utilized the pyruvic acid in order to produce your anaerobic energy. Well, now there is no pyruvic acid, okay, because it wants to use your ketones. It wants to use fats. So what happens is your body breaks down big fats to fatty acids, and then in combination with the fatty acids, it breaks down your acetyl-CoA enzyme. Now, as you remember, it's your acetyl-CoA enzyme that was responsible for entering the Krebs cycle and starting that process. That's why this doesn't happen without an absolute need. So ketones aren't produced without an absolute need for energy in the absence of any other means. Okay, glycerol will take too long, we don't have any pyruvic acid, all those things that go wrong. So now we need to use ketones, basically. We need to use this process in order to produce your ketone. Okay, once your ketones is produced, you've lost two acetyl-CoA enzymes, CoA enzymes. Okay, gone. And it produces acetyl-CoA, and that is your ketone body. Now from there, the liver will break down that, and it will produce acetone, and with the acetone, you get the energy released. From there, the energy and all that sort of stuff is able to transport to the cells in order to feed them, basically. Okay, but this builds up the acetone within the body itself. Okay, and it also produces free-flowing keto bodies throughout the system, okay, which obviously can cause a bit of a problem. The reason is a ketone itself is a weak acid. Okay, ketone attracts hydrogen protons to itself, so it's a weak acid. So when it's found in abundance within the body. It can be used as an alternate food source for a while without any complications. Okay, the state that we know as ketosis. But then eventually, once all the fuel systems have dropped down, then ketogenesis has to kick in. Now, once all the fuel sources are gone, there's no more carbohydrates or very limited, then ketogenesis will kick in and the body will go into a state of ketosis, which essentially means using ketones as its main source, producing that acetone and getting that acid. Now, one of the massive side effects of this process is often found in type 1 diabetics, and that's ketoacidosis. Now, obviously, this can also occur for anybody who's on a ketogenic diet or is not really doing a ketogenic diet safely, if you will. So type 1 diabetes often get ketoacidosis. Now, the reason for that is actually because of the abundance of sugar within the bloodstream that can't get into the cells. So the glucose molecule has to get into the cell in order to get to the cytosol to be utilized to break down to pyruvic acid before it can be used as energy. So it's got all this sugar, but nothing in its cell. So it starts using fats, and that builds up excess ketones in the body, and that overall build-up of ketones lowers the body's pH. So they get acidotic, and the acidosis obviously does what acidosis does. It impairs cardiac and enzyme function, and it kills you. And that's what ketoacidosis is. Okay, and it's quite a significant risk of diabetics that don't regulate their sugars or take their insulin, things like that. Okay. Another thing that fats produce, which is a little bit of a byproduct, if you will, is cholesterol. Now, cholesterol is excessively important. Okay, excessively important substance. Okay, it is the cholesterol that makes most of your structures that I was talking about before. It is the actual cholesterol that is responsible for that production itself. So cholesterol is never used for energy because it is too important. Now, cholesterol has to be at certain levels, and only about 15% of all your cholesterol comes from our diet. And that's why people who don't eat meat or don't have high cholesterol can still have reasonably high cholesterol from there. You don't need meat and all that sort of stuff in order to get cholesterol, because most of it can come down from the breakdown products as a result of your bile. Okay, and that produces your cholesterol, which is pretty cool. Now, the two main types of cholesterol that we look at is our LDL and HDL. Now, the thing to know about cholesterol itself is it's not soluble, so it can't actually travel anywhere in the body by itself. So it has to bind to a lipoprotein. Okay, so lipoprotein are produced in the small bowel, and they transport your cholesterol around. And that's where we get the words LDL and HDL around. So a low density lipoprotein, or an LDL, is responsible for transporting that cholesterol and the fatty acids to the cell body. So it will take the fats to the body, and then it will go from there. Now, obviously, if you have a huge high circulation of LDL, there is a risk of these fatty deposits sticking to the side of the arteries, or sticking to the side of the vessels, so therefore causing your atherosclerosis. Okay, so if you have high concentrations, some of them can stick to the wall and then essentially produce a plaque. That is why LDL cholesterol, even though they are extremely vital to body function, have been labelled your bad fats. Now, your high density lipoproteins, they're responsible for taking fats to the liver in order to be broken down for the process that we just talked about, making glycerol, making those fatty acids for energy production. So they're very important, but because they remove the fats from the blood and therefore reduce the likelihood of atherosclerosis and sometimes even break down immature plaques that have been formed, they've been deemed the good fats. Okay, but essentially they both have a very important function within the body itself. Okay, so that's fats. As you know, absence of carbohydrates, specialized organs will utilize fats. Proteins, on the other hand, proteins are never really the preferred source for metabolism. Okay, the only time they become the absolute preferred source or a viable source is if we have a lot of amino acids flowing around the body. If we don't, then the body definitely does not like to use proteins as its energy source. But we'll go through the process of how it can occur. So first of all, proteins are pretty simple. Okay, you get in there, you get a large protein, and then in the presence of hydrochloric acid, obviously pepsinogen is produced, and it's the pepsinogen, which is a digestible enzyme, that will break down proteins into polypeptide, which is a big way of saying a lot of amino acid chains stuck together. Once it travels into the smaller tryptophan for absorption, your polypeptides are broken down into amino acids, and then they go into the bloodstream to be utilized by your cells. That's the way proteins work. Nice and simple compared to the other two. Now, these proteins, or amino acids, are broken up into different classes. So glucogenic, ketogenic, and then your alternate amino acids. So there's about 20 different amino acids within the body, and the way that they help in metabolism and becoming part of the whole process is your glucogenic amino acids. They are combined and they become pyruvic acid. Okay, now pyruvic acid can go one or two ways. It can either combine itself to become glucose in order to go back to the liver to go through turning into glycogen in order to get storage. Okay, that's one way you can go. Or if it's needed, the pyruvic acid can turn into acetyl-CoA and then start the process from there, and therefore producing your extra ATP as well. Okay, so that's something that it can do. Now, your ketogenic amino acids, they're converted straight to acetyl-CoA. Now, the acetyl-CoA, depending on how much the body needs, they can themselves be transferred back into fatty acids and turned into triglycerides within the fat itself. Or, if needed, they can pop straight into the citric acid cycle. Okay, so they've got a few options. Now, some of the other amino acids that float around the body, I think 14, last time I read amino acids, they can enter the citric acid cycle itself and become part of one of these 8 coenzyme base processes that are needed in order to produce ATP. Okay. Now, as you can see, as a result of each one of these reactions, depending on which one it is, we have a byproduct produced, and that byproduct is NH2, okay, or ammonia. Now, ammonia is quite cytotoxic, okay, particularly to neural cells as well. So this is why one of the reasons is body doesn't like using amino acids as its metabolic source, is because of this reduction of amino acid. It does it sometimes, as we'll talk about, but it is not a preferred way because of the byproduct to do it long term. Okay? And if it is long term, this is what starvation looks like itself. Okay. Now, just wanted to note, whilst we can convert everything all over the place, acetyl-CoA cannot be backdragged to make glucose. Okay, it just can't happen. Just to let you know. Okay, so that's not an option. Go the other way. Now, all these free-flowing amino acids around the body, what they generally do, and the only reason they're really used, is if there's an abundance. Now, it takes a little bit of effort to get an abundance of amino acids, because every single cell of our body needs a mix of amino acids. So all 20 amino acids, it needs a mix of. Now, a lot of the cells, or all the cells, sorry, cannot get certain amino acids from anywhere else but their food. Okay, so every cell needs to soak up the amino acids, ideally before we have excess amino acids, before the body is happy to use the excess amino acids in its metabolic function. Now, the reason it needs a mix is because all your protein structures, enzymes, hormones, coenzymes, everything within the cell that's protein based is made of amino acids. And it's actually the combination and the way the amino acids are stacked together within the ribosomes that will produce certain structures. Okay, so just because there's 20 doesn't mean there's only 20 functions, because the way those 20 line up in different orders produce completely different structures. Okay, now that's another lesson for itself, but just trust me that know that the cell needs a lot of amino acids in order to regenerate itself and function, okay? Particular endocrine cells and stuff like that. Now, that's one way that protein is used, when there's an abundance. The other way is if the body has no choice. Okay, so if you have no fats, you have no carbohydrates, therefore the body goes, well, I need energy, so it has to break down proteins. Now, as mentioned, it produces ammonia. Very, very toxic to the cells, and it essentially has to go to the liver in order to metabolize ammonia into urea. And then urea needs to be excreted into the urine. When urea builds up in the blood, you get a condition known as azotemia. So it's essentially proteins are not the best way to go if we can avoid it. So that is the metabolism of a cell, the metabolism of energy, in a nutshell. So it starts with the digestion of large foods into usable forms, and then from there it goes through its initial phase, glycolysis and pre-citric acid phase, if you will. Okay, now this is done in the cytosol of the cell. From there it moves into the matrix, into the mitochondria, and then into the matrix of the mitochondria itself before it goes into your Krebs cycle. From there, as mentioned, it goes back to the membrane in order to go through its electron transfer phase. Now, depending on the substance that's used, will determine whether or not the entire process is carried out and what sort of byproducts are produced as a result of that metabolism in the quest to produce energy for our body. So the body helps itself out some ways. When you need to, it will have energy for reserves. That's why these ketogenics don't actually kick in for a couple of days. That's why you eat weekend, do explosive activities really quickly and without producing need to produce extra energy, is because of these extra reserve substances. So the glucose itself, we've already talked about to death, okay? Stored in glycogen and fats. Okay, that's where the glucose comes from. Stored around the body, no problems at all. Okay, so glycogen and fats within the muscles and within the liver itself. We also have an area within the muscles that allows us to store additional O2. Okay, and that's myoglobin. Now, myoglobin doesn't just pick up an oxygen molecule and then use it straight away. It actually store it in the muscles itself. That's why when you look at muscles, if someone gets injured, that sort of thing, the muscle looks bright red, okay, because it's oxidized with the myoglobin. That's why when you buy fresh meat, it's quite red because of myoglobin. Okay, so that's where the extra O2 stores are found, ready to be used within the muscles itself. Now, additional stores of ATP are stored in skeletal muscle in the form of creatine phosphate. So creatine phosphate is essentially utilized at the start during explosive activities. What happens is the creatine dumps its phosphate, which creates the same energy as ATP becoming ADP. That's it. Okay, so it just dumps it, creates the energy, but it's short-lived. Okay, and then it has to regenerate itself. And then, of course, we have adipose tissue. Now, adipose tissue is nothing but reserve stored energy. Okay, unfortunately, the body doesn't know when to stop storing energy in the forms of adipose, which is why we have such a chronic problem of obesity. Okay, so speaking of chronic problem of obesity, we'll finish off looking at balance and your metabolic rate itself. So balance is pretty simple to explain realistically. Every energy you create is based on food that comes in. Okay, when you lose fats, it's because you're essentially breaking it down, and a lot of the time you're blowing it off as CO2. That's the end product, if you remember. The end result of all this glycolysis and all the actual energy production is the production of water, which you can excrete, and CO2. So that's what happens to your fats when you lose weight. Okay, so that's your input. Your output, a lot of the energy produced is used just to maintain your internal body temperature. Now, obviously, your body temperature is needed to optimize function. Okay, so most of the energy produced in what we've talked about, and metabolism and all that sort of stuff, is lost to heat. Does it get to be utilised for ATP at all. Okay, so 60% they say lost to heat and constantly needs to be replaced because we're always losing heat. Next is obviously using the energy as output, working physical kinetic output, which is ATP, and then the rest of it is stored. Whatever you don't use is stored, and that's the dangerous part. Now, things that tell us our body that we need to get more intake compared to output. So the intake is regulated by neural stimulus in the forms of baroreceptors found in the digestive system. Stomach's empty, baroreceptor tells us, let's fill it. Okay, we also have humoral stimulus, chemoreceptors that measure the iron levels within our body. And then there's hormonal stimulus, which is leptin. Okay, leptin coming from the adipose tissue tells us that we're hungry. Now, a lot of scientists have argued the last two, psychological and temperature control, and how much it plays a part in the overall hunger regulation or source for hunger. But I think anybody listening knows that psychological factors like stress, pleasure, play a huge role in what we eat. Okay, and temperature control as well. Generally, when you're cold, you feel the need to eat in order to generate more heat, as discussed. Okay, so that's what controls our hunger regulation. Now, in the event that you're eating way too much or not eating enough, it goes all the way back to the difference between an anabolic reaction versus a catabolic reaction. Okay, so the difference is quite simple. When you've got an abundance of food, you've got more food than you need, then your body won't use all the energy straight away based on what you eat, but it will store it as glycogen, as fat, it will break down the proteins, and obviously it will use some of the energy, but it will have a lot and it will anabolize. Okay, we'll go through an anabolic reaction in order to store potential energy for later. In the event that you're not getting enough food in, so no input or no input right now, it goes through the catabolic reaction. Okay, and that's where it transfers fats and glycogen into glucose, glycerol into glucose, all that sort of stuff happens, and the process of creating energy occurs. Every day you have a mixture of anabolic versus catabolic reactions. Okay, even if you've eaten a huge breakfast and then worked out in the evening or worked out straight away, you'll still have that same sort of mixture between the two. It's when it gets chronic, one way or the other, is when we start getting our problems associated with too much storage of adipose tissue versus the byproducts generated by ketones and amino acids. So, speaking of what our body utilizes, there's two different rates that we can talk about. So there's your basal metabolic rate. Now this is your metabolic rate that your body needs to do no activity at all. So this is to generate its function, breathing, metabolizing, contraction of the heart, all that sort of stuff that we have no real control over. That is your basal metabolic rate. So certain factors increase the metabolic rate for your basal metabolic rate, and a lot of people get really confused by this. So I just need to specify that your basal metabolic rate is the rate in which that human will use energy doing no activity, physical activity at all. Okay, that's what we're talking about here. So things that increase that is people that have an increased body surface area to volume ratio. Now that does not mean large humans, that actually means small humans. Okay, so a small, skinny person has a large body surface area to volume ratio. Essentially think of it as a way they're no good at retaining heat. So because they lose heat easily, they generally have a higher basal metabolic rate. Males tend to have a higher one than females. If you have an increased temperature or increased stress, adrenal response is higher. And obviously thyroxine is the main contributor to your basal metabolic rate. Okay, so in contrast, when you get older, if you're female, or if you have a decreased thyroxine, you'll have a lower basal metabolic rate. Now training, working out, has very little effect on your basal metabolic rate. Very little effect. Now, people will often say, well, if I've got a huge amount of skeletal muscles, then I'm going to need a lot more energy in order to function. And you're right, you do. But that function involves movement. And I already specified that this is doing nothing at all. No movement at all. That's the basal metabolic rate. To calculate it, we have a Harris-Benedict formula. Now, this was made a hell of a long time ago. Pretty sure back in 1918 or something like that is when it first came out. And from there it's been revised a few times. So what you're seeing now is a calculation from 1990. Okay, now this is an absolute estimate. Okay, it's an estimate. Every body, every human is different, but I just put this in here for your interest. Now, I'm not going to go through the equation because it is just simple to figure out yourself. So basically, if you use this formula, the basal metabolic rate of a 30-year-old male who is 175 centimeters tall and 83 kilos is 1,779 kilocalories per day. Now, kilocalories is the same way as saying a calorie in which you read. Okay, so if you're reading calories and you're using those calorie calculator things, essentially kilocalories are the same thing. It's just based on an equation of how much is utilized over a period of time. That's all it is. Okay, so don't worry, you don't have to find any conversion or anything like that. That's just what it is. Now, obviously, what if we move? Okay, that's obviously going to change things completely. So the more you move, the more skeletal muscle activities you have, increases this metabolic rate. Okay, and also eating, believe it or not, increases your metabolic rate, but it puts more calories inside you as well. So you've got to be careful with what you're eating and how high in calories they are. So fats, huge calorie content per weight, okay, whereas opposed to your simple carbohydrates are quite light in calories per weight. So if you're eating, you have an increased metabolic rate. Definitely if you're working out, you have an increased metabolic rate. So that's where total metabolic rate comes into. So from there we can figure out what sort of person we are. Okay, so it's not very difficult to get up with the realms of vigorous activity. So if you have a relatively active job and you exercise, you can get up to the 2.25. Okay, but most people like to sit around the active to moderate activity. Okay, so that's generally where most people, especially in the military, will sit. And if you're a very active sort of trainer, you can probably get up there a little bit higher. But like I said, it's a complete guesstimate, and it's only to be used really as a guide at a pure interest for yourself. Okay, now I've never been an advocate for counting calories and that sort of thing, but in the event that you did and you figured out the equation for yourself, then what we recommend is healthy weight loss. Healthy weight loss is essentially reducing your TMA, your total metabolic rate, by 20%. Now, what happens if you go further and you start entering that carbohydrate starvation stage is you will lose glucose in the forms of glycogen very quickly. Now, glucose has a huge affinity to water, so it's basically about a 1-to-3 ratio. Okay, so that basically means that when you shed your body of glucose, shed your body of all those reserve stores made from carbohydrates, and you're not giving it any more, then you will lose 4 times the amount you had lost in glucose. So if you lose 250 grams in glucose, you'll lose a kilo of weight. Make sense? So that's why people get in what's known as a yo-yo diet, because you've depleted your body, and then you eat something, your body goes, oh, I'm going to store this glucose, and it puts it right back in, absorbing the water as well. So people will fluctuate up and down like a yo-yo because they're trying more radical-based diets than just using total metabolic rate as a more of a guide and thinking about the different energy pathways. Now, I'm by no means a physical trainer or a specialist in weight loss. You're going to find so much information based on that. I'm just talking about metabolism and energy and the way the body utilizes different compounds. That's all. So hopefully